Hi. Hello there. Hello. Welcome. 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 Or should I say? Pretend I don't have to reload my voice. I'm having issues with my voice. Oh no. I'm having issues with my voice. It's sad. It's sad. It truly is. Very sad. It's the cats again. There are no cats here. So I was saying... Hello? Huh. That's better. That's better. Hello. Welcome. You came back to play with me. Welcome. What do you say again? How do you say it? Ah, yes. Ohaku. Ohaku Morse. Elauto. Andre. No Axel. Radio. Nimmy. F. Ussi. Mo. Loon. Deagle. Please. Oh. Ha. Good. Welcome back. I want to read you a story. I will read you a story. Okay? Let's read. Today's story. I like stories. I like stories. I like stories. Do you like stories? Listen to the story. Okay? Okay. It's time for a story. Am I supposed to read the title of a book? Or can you tell what it is from the thumbnail? This is what you call these, right? Thumbnails. This is called the Call of Cthulhu. Of such great powers or beings, there may be conceivably a survival. A survival of a hugely remote period when consciousness was manifested, perhaps in shapes and forms long since withdrawn before the tide of advancing humanity. Forms of which poetry and legend alone have caught a flying memory and called them gods, monsters, mythical beings of all sorts and kinds. Am I a god, monster, or mythical being? Are you a god, monster, or mythical being? One. The horror in clay. The most merciful thing in the world, I think, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its content. We live on a placid island of ignorance in the midst of black seas of infinity, and it was not meant that we should voyage far. The sciences, each straining in its own direction, have harmed us little. But someday, the piecing together of dissociated knowledge will open up such terrifying vistas of reality and of our frightful position therein, that we shall either go mad from the revelation or flee from the deadly light into the peace and safety of a new dark age. Theosophists have guessed at the awesome grandeur of the cosmic cycle wherein our world and human race form transient incidents. They have hinted at strange survivals in terms which would freeze the blood if not masked by a bland optimism. But it is not from them that there came the single glimpse of forbidden eons which chills me when I think of it and maddens me when I dream of it. That glimpse, like all dread glimpses of truth, flashed out from an accidental piecing together of separated things. In this case, an old newspaper item and the notes of a dead professor. I hope that no one else will accomplish this piecing out. Certainly, if I live, I shall never knowingly supply a link in so hideous a chain. I think that the professor, too, intended to keep silent regarding the part he knew, and that he would have destroyed his notes had not sudden death seized him. My knowledge of the thing began in the winter of 1926-27, with the death of my grand-uncle, George Gamble Angel, Professor Emeritus of Semitic Languages in Brown University, Providence, Rhode Island. Professor Angel was widely known as an authority on ancient inscriptions, and had frequently been resorted to by the heads of prominent museums, so that his passing at the age of 92 may be recalled by many. Locally, interest was intensified by the obscurity of the cause of death. The professor had been stricken whilst returning from the Newport boat, falling suddenly, as witnesses said, after having been jostled by a nautical-looking... I can't read that. Who had come from one of the queer dark carts of the precipitous hillsides, which formed a shortcut from the waterfront to the deceased's home in William Street. Physicians were unable to find any visible disorder, but concluded after perplexed debate that some obscure lesion of the heart, induced by the brisk ascent of so steep a hill by so elderly a man, was responsible for the end. At the time, I saw no reason to dissent from this dictum, but latterly I am inclined to wonder, and more than wonder. As my granduncle's heir and executor, for he died a childless widower, I was expected to go over his papers with some thoroughness. For that purpose, moved his entire set of files and boxes to my quarters in Boston. Much of the material which I correlated will be later published by the American Archaeological Society, but there was one box which I found exceedingly puzzling, and which I felt much averse from showing to other eyes. It had been locked, and I did not find the key till it occurred to me to examine the personal ring which the professor carried always in his pocket. Then indeed I succeeded in opening it, and when I did so, seemed only to be confronted by a greater and more closely locked barrier. For what could be the meaning of the queer clay, bas-relief, and the disjointed jottings, ramblings, and cuttings which I felt? Had my uncle in his later years become credulous of the most superficial impostures? I resolved to search out the eccentric sculptor responsible for this apparent disturbance of an old man's peace of mind. The bas-relief was a rough rectangle, less than an inch thick and about 5 by 6 inches in area, obviously of modern origin. Its designs, however, were far from modern in atmosphere and suggestion, for although vagaries of cubism and futurism are many and wild, they do not often reproduce that cryptic regularity which lurks in prehistoric writing, and writing of some kind the bulk of these designs seems certainly to be. Though my memory, despite much familiarity with the papers and collection of my uncle, failed in any way to identify this particular species, or even hint at its remotest affiliations. Above these apparent hieroglyphs was a figure of evidently pictorial intent, though its impressionistic execution forbade a very clear idea of its nature. It seemed to be a sort of monster, or symbol representing a monster, of a form which only a deceased fancy could conceive. If I say that my somewhat extravagant imagination yielded simultaneous pictures of an octopus, a dragon, and a human caricature, I shall not be unfaithful to the spirit of the thing. A pulpy, tentacled head surmounted a grotesque and scaly body with rudimentary wings. But it was the general outline of the whole which made it most shockingly frightful. Behind the figure was a vague suggestion of a cyclopean architectural background. The writing accompanying this oddity was, aside from a stack of press cuttings, in Professor Angel's most recent end. It made no pretense to literary style. What seemed to be the main document was headed Cthulhu Cthulhu cult, in characters painstakingly printed to avoid the erroneous reading of a word so unheard of. This manuscript was divided into 2 sections, the first of which was headed 1925, Dream and Dream Work of H.A. Wilcox, 7 Thomas Street, Providence, R.I., and the second, Narrative of Inspector John R. LaGrasse, 121 Bienville Street, New Orleans, LA, at 1908 AAS, MDG. Notes on same and Professor Webb's Act. The other manuscript papers were all brief notes, some of them accounts of the queer dreams of different persons, some of them citations from theosophical books and magazines. Notably W. Scott Eliot's Atlantis and Lost Lemuria. And the rest comments on long-surviving secret societies and hidden cults, with references to passages in such mythological and anthropological source books as Fraser's Golden Ball and Miss Murray's Witch Cult in Western Europe. The cuttings largely alluded to outright mental illnesses and outbreaks of group folly or mania in the spring of 1925. The first half of the principal manuscript told a very peculiar tale. It appears on March 1st, 1925. A thin young man of neurotic and excited aspect had called upon Professor Angel, bearing the singular clay bas-relief, which was then exceedingly damp and French. French? Fresh? Not the same thing. His card bore the name of Henry Anthony Wilcox. My uncle had recognized him as the youngest son of an excellent family, slightly known to him, who had latterly been studying sculpture at the Rhode Island School of Design, living alone at the Fleur-de-Lis building near that institution. Wilcox was a precocious youth of known genius, but great eccentricity, and had from childhood excited attention through the strange stories and odd dreams he was in the habit of relating. He called himself psychically hypersensitive. But the said folk of the ancient commercial city dismissed him as merely queer. Never mingling much with his kind, he had dropped gradually from social visibility, and was now known only to a small group of estates from other towns. Even the Providence Art Club, anxious to preserve its conservatism, had found him quite hopeless. On the occasion of the visit around the professor's manuscript, the sculptor abruptly asked for the benefit of his host's archaeological knowledge and in identifying the hieroglyphs on the bas-relief. He spoke in a dreamy, stilted manner, which suggested pose and alienated sympathy. And my uncle showed some sharpness in replying, for the conspicuous freshness of the tablet implied kinship with anything but archaeology. Young Wilcox's rejoinder, which impressed my uncle enough to make him recall and record it verbatim, was of a fantastically poetic cast, which must have typified his whole conversation, and which I have since found highly characteristic of him. He said, "It is new, indeed, for I made it last night in a dream of strange cities, and dreams are older than brooding Tyre, or the contemplative Sphinx, or garden-girdled Babylon." It was then that he began that rambling tale, which suddenly played upon a sleeping memory and won the fevered interest of my uncle. There had been a slight earthquake tremor the night before, the most considerable felt in New England for some years, and Wilcox's imagination had been keenly affected. On retiring, He had had an unprecedented dream of great cyclopean cities of titan blocks and sky-flying monolith, all dripping with green ooze and sinister with latent horror. Hieroglyphics had covered the walls and pillars, and from some undetermined point below had come a voice that was not a voice, a chaotic sensation, which only fancy could transmute into sound, but which he attempted to render by an almost unpronounceable jumble of letters. This verbal jumble was the key to the recollection which excited and disturbed Professor Angel. He questioned the sculptor with scientific minuteness and studied with almost frantic intensity the bas-relief on which the youth had found himself working, chilled and clad only in his nightclothes, when waking had stolen bewilderingly over him. My uncle blamed his old age. Wilcox afterwards said, for his slowness in recognizing both hieroglyphics and pictorial design. Many of his questions seemed highly out of place to his visitor, especially those which tried to connect the latter with strange cults or societies, and Wilcox could not understand the repeated promise of silence, which he was offered in exchange for an admission of membership in some widespread mystical or paganly religious body. When Professor Angel became convinced that the sculptor was indeed ignorant of any cult or system of cryptic lore, he besieged his visitor with demands for future reports of dreams. This bore regular fruit, for after the first interview, the manuscript records daily calls of the young man, during which he related startling fragments of nocturnal imagery whose burden was always some terrible cyclopean vista of dark and dripping stone with a subterranean voice or intelligence, shouting monotonously enigmatical sense impacts uninscribable save as gibberish. Two sounds most frequently repeated are those rendered by the letters Cthulhu and Roulette. On March 23rd, the manuscript continued. Wilcox failed to appear, and inquiries at his quarters revealed that he had been stricken with an obscure sort of fever and taken to the home of his family in Waterman Street. He'd cried out in the night, rousing several other artists in the building, and manifested since then only alternations of unconsciousness and delirium. My uncle at once telephoned the family, and from that time forward kept close watch of the case, calling often as at the street office of Dr. Tobey, whom he learned to be in charge. The youth's febrile mind, apparently, was dwelling on strange things, and the doctors shuddered now and then as he spoke of them. They included not only a repetition of what he had formerly dreamed, but touched wildly on a gigantic thing, miles high, which walked or lumbered about. He had no time fully described this object, but occasional frantic words, as repeated by Dr. Tobey, convinced the professor that it must be identical with the nameless monstrosity he had sought to depict in his dream sculpture. Reference to this object, the doctor added, was invariably a prelude to the young man's subsidence to lethargy. His temperature, oddly enough, was not greatly above normal. The whole condition was otherwise such as to suggest true fever rather than mental disorder. On April 2nd, at about 3 p.m., every trace of Wilcox's malady suddenly ceased. He sat upright in bed, astonished to find himself at home and completely ignorant of what had happened in dream or reality since the night of March 22nd. Pronounced well by his physician, he returned to his quarters in 3 days. But to Professor Angel, he was of no further assistance. All traces of strange dreaming had vanished with his recovery, and my uncle kept no record of his night thoughts after a week of pointless and irrelevant accounts of thoroughly usual visions. Here, the first part of the manuscript ended. But references to certain of the scattered notes gave me much material for thought. So much, in fact, that only the ingrained skepticism informing my philosophy can account for my continued distrust of the artist. The notes in question were those descriptive of the dreams of various persons covering the same period as that in which young Wilcox had had his strange visitation. My uncle, it seems, had quickly instituted a prodigiously far-flung body of inquiries amongst nearly all the friends whom he could question without impertinence, asking for nightly reports of their dreams and the dates of any notable visions for some time past. The reception of his requests seems to have been varied, but he must at the very least have received more responses than any ordinary man could have handled without a secretary. His original correspondence was not preserved, but his notes form a thorough and really significant digest. Average people in society and business, in New England's traditional salt of the earth, give an almost completely negative result. Though scattered cases of uneasy but formless nocturnal impressions appear here and there, always between March 23rd and April 2nd, the period of young Wilcox's delirium. Scientific men were a little more affected, though 4 cases of vague description suggest fugitive glimpses of strange landscape, and in one case, there is mentioned a dread of something abnormal. It was from the artists and poets that the pertinent answers came, and I know that panic would have broken loose had they been able to compare notes. As it was, lacking the original letters, I half suspected the compiler of having asked leading questions or of having edited the correspondence in corroboration of what he had latently resolved to see. That is why I continued to feel that Wilcox, somehow cognizant of the old data which my uncle had possessed, had been imposing on the veteran scientist. These responses from estates told a disturbing tale. From February 28th to April 2nd, a large proportion of them had dreamed very bizarre things, the intensity of the dreams being immeasurably the stronger during the period of the sculptor's delirium. Over a fourth of those who reported anything reported scenes and half-sounds not unlike those which Wilcox had described. And some of the dreamers confessed acute fear of the gigantic nameless thing visible towards the last. One case, which the note describes with emphasis, was very sad. Subject, a widely known architect with leanings towards theosophy and occultism, went violently insane on the date of young Wilcox's seizure, and expired several months later after incessant screamings to be saved from some escaped denizen of hell. Had my uncle referred to these cases by name instead of merely by number, I should have attempted some corroboration and personal investigation. But as it was, I succeeded in tracing down only a few. All of these, however, bore out the notes in full. I have often wondered if all the objects of the professor's questioning felt as puzzled as did this fraction. It is well that no explanation shall ever reach them. The press cuttings, as I have intimated, touched on cases of panic, mania, and eccentricity during the given period. Professor Angel must have employed a cutting bureau, for the number of extracts was tremendous, and the sources scattered throughout the globe. Here was a nocturnal suicide in London. or a lone sleeper had leaped from a window after a shocking cry. Here likewise a rambling letter to the editor of a paper in South America, where a fanatic deduces a dire future from visions he has seen. A dispatch from California describes a theosophist colony as donning white robes en masse for some glorious fulfillment which never arrives, whilst items from India speak guardedly of serious need of unrest toward the end of March. Americans officers in the Philippines find certain tribes bothersome about this time, and New York policemen are mobbed by hysterical Levantines on the night of March 22-23rd. The west of Ireland, too, is full of wild rumors and legendary, and a fantastic painter named Ardo Bonneau hangs a blasphemous dream landscape in the Paris Spring Salon of 1926. And so numerous are the recorded troubles in insane asylums that only a miracle can have stopped the medical fraternity from noting strange parallelism and drawing mystified conclusions. A weird bunch of cuttings, all told, and I can at this date scarcely envisage the callous rationalism which I used to set them aside. But I was then convinced that young Wilcox had known of the older matters mentioned by the professor.
How do you feel about it so far? How do you feel about it so far, Let's go to the second part. Interested? Interesting. The Tale of Inspector Legrasse.
The older matters which had made the sculptor's dream and bas-relief so significant to my uncle formed the subject of the second half of his long manuscript. Once before, it appears, Professor Angel had seen the hellish outlines of the nameless monstrosity, puzzled over the unknown hieroglyphs, and heard the ominous syllables, which can be rendered only as Cthulhu. An oldest and so stirring and horrible a connection that it is small wonder he pursued young Wilcox with queries and demands for data. This earlier experience had come in 1908, 17 years before, when the American Archaeological Society held its annual meeting in St. Louis. Professor Angel, as befitted one of his authority and attainments, had had a prominent part in all the deliberations, and was one of the first to be approached by the several outsiders who took advantage of the convocation to offer questions for correct answering and problems for expert solution. The chief of these outsiders, and in a short time the focus of interest for the entire meeting, was a commonplace-looking middle-aged man who had traveled all the way from New Orleans for certain special information unobtainable from any local source. His name was John Raymond Legrasse, and he was by profession an inspector of police. With him he bore the subject of his visit, a grotesque, repulsive, and apparently very ancient stone statuette, whose origin he was at loss to determine. It must not be fancied that Inspector Legrasse had the least interest in archaeology. On the contrary, his wish for enlightenment was prompted by purely professional considerations. The statuette, idol, fetish, or whatever it was, had been captured some months before in the wooded swamps south of New Orleans. And so singular and hideous were the rites connected with it, the police could not but realize that they had stumbled on a dark cult, totally unknown to them, and infinitely more diabolic than everything they'd seen before. Of its origin, apart from the erratic and unbelievable tales extorted from the captured members, absolutely nothing was to be discovered. Hence the anxiety of the police for any antiquarian lore which might help them to place a frightful symbol, and through it track down the cult to its fountainhead. Inspector Legrasse was scarcely prepared for the sensation which his offering created. One sight of the thing had been enough to throw the assembled men of science into a state of tense excitement, and they lost no time in crowding around him to gaze at the diminutive figure, whose utter strangeness and air of genuinely abysmal antiquity hinted so potently at unopened and archaic vistas. No recognized school of sculpture had animated this terrible object, yet centuries and even thousands of years seemed recording in its dim and greenish surface of unplaceable stone. The figure, which was finally passed slowly from man to man for close and careful study, was between 7 and 8 inches in height, and of exquisitely artistic workmanship. It represented a monster of vaguely anthropoid outline, but with an octopus-like head whose face was a mass of feelers, a scaly, rubbery-looking body, prodigious claws on hind and 4 feet, and long, narrow wings behind. This thing, which seemed instinct with a fearsome and unnatural malignancy, was of a somewhat bloated corpulence and squatted evilly on a rectangular block or pedestal covered with undecipherable characters. The tips of the wings touched the black edges of the block. The seat occupied the center, whilst the long curved claws of the doubled-up, crouching hind legs gripped the front edge and extended a quarter of the way down towards the bottom of the pedestal. The cephalopod head was bent forward so that the end of the facial feelers brushed the back of huge forepaws, which clasped the croucher's elevated knees. The aspect of the whole was abnormally lifelike and the more subtly fearful because its source was totally unknown. Its vast, wholesome, and incalculable age was unmistakable, yet no one link did it show with any known type of art belonging to civilization's youth, or indeed to any other time. Totally separate and apart, its very material was a mystery. The soapy greenish-black stone with its golden or iridescent flecks and striations resembled nothing familiar to geology or mineralogy. The characters along the base were equally baffling, and no member present, despite a representation of half the world's expert learning in this field, could form the least notion of even their remotest linguistic kinship. They, like the subject and material, belonged to something horribly remote and distinct from mankind as we know it. Something frightfully suggestive of old and unhallowed cycles of life, in which our world and our conceptions have no part. And yet, some members severally shook their heads and confessed defeat at the inspector's problem. There was one man in that gathering who suspected a touch of bizarre familiarity in the monstrous shape and writing, and who presently told with some diffidence of the odd trifle he knew. This person was the late William Channing Webb, professor of anthropology in Princeton University, and an explorer of no slight note. Professor Webb had been engaged 48 years before in a tour of Greenland and Iceland in search of some runic inscriptions, which he failed to unearth. And whilst high up on the West Greenland coast, had he encountered a singular tribe, or cult of degenerate. It was, I lost my line. Professor Webb had been engaged 48 years before in a tour of Greenland and Iceland in search of some runic inscriptions, which he failed to unearth, and whilst high up on the West Greenland coast, had encountered a singular tribe or cult of degenerate whose religion, a curious form of devil worship, chilled him with its deliberate bloodthirstiness and repulsiveness. It was a faith of which other inhabitants of the country knew little, and which they mentioned only with shudders, saying they had come down from horribly ancient eons before even the world was made. Besides nameless rites and human sacrifices, there were certain queer hereditary rituals addressed to a supreme elder devil or Tornasak. And of this, Professor Webb had taken a careful phonetic copy from an aged Angakok or wizard priest, expressing the sound in Roman letters as best as he knew how. But just now of prime significance was the fetish which this cult had cherished, and around which they danced when the aurora leaped high over the ice cliffs. It was, the professor stated, a very crude bas-relief of stone, comprising a hideous picture and some cryptic writing. And as far as he could tell, it was a rough parallel in all essential features of the bestial thing now lying before the meeting. These data, received with suspense and astonishment by the assembly members, proved doubly exciting to Inspector Legrasse, and he began at once to ply his informant with questions. Having noted and copied an oral ritual among the swamp cult worshippers his men had arrested, he besought the professor to remember as best he might the syllables taken down amongst the diabolist cult. There then followed an exhaustive comparison of details, and a moment of really awed silence, when both detective and scientist agreed on the virtual identity of the phrase common to the hellish rituals, so many worlds of distance apart. What in substance had been chanted by both groups to their kindred idols was something very like this, the word divisions being guessed at from traditional breaks in the phrase as chanted aloud.
I hope you do not expect me to read that.
Legrasse had at one point in advance of Professor Webb, for several among his mongrel prisoners had repeated to him what older celebrants had told them the words meant. This text as given ran something like this. In his house, truly is dead, Cthulhu waits dreaming. That bad, yeah, that bad. Here, I want to put it in chat for you guys. You have fun reading that. You have fun reading that. I'm not reading that aloud. And now, in response to a general urgent demand, Inspector Legrasse related as fully as possible his experience with the swamp worshippers, telling a story to which I could see my uncle attach profound significance. It savored of the wildest dreams of mythmaker and theosophist, and disclosed an astonishing degree of cosmic imagination among such half-castes and pariahs as might be least expected to possess it. On November 1st, 1907, there had come to New Orleans police a frantic summons from the swamp and lagoon country to the south. The people there were in the gripe of stark terror from an unknown thing which had stolen upon them in the night. It was voodoo, apparently, but voodoo of a more terrible sort than they had ever known. Instead of their women and children had disappeared. There were insane shouts and harrowing screams, soul-chilling chants and dancing devil flames, and the frightened messenger added, the people could stand it no more. So, a body of 20 police, filling 2 carriages and an automobile, had set out in the late afternoon, with the shivering squatter as a guide. At the end of the passable road they alighted, and for miles flashed on in silence through the terrible cypress wood where day never came. Ugly roots and malignant hanging nooses of Spanish moss beset them, and now and then a pile of dank stones or fragments of a rotting wall, intensified by its hints of morbid habitation, a depression which every malformed tree and every fungus islet combined to create. At length, the squatter settlement, a miserable huddle, hove in sight, and hysterical dwellers ran out to cluster around the group of bobbing lanterns. The muffled beat of tom-toms was now faintly audible, far, far ahead. A curdling shriek came at infrequent intervals when the wind shifted. A reddish glare, too, seemed to filter through the pale undergrowth beyond endless avenues of forest night. Reluctant even to be left alone again, each one of the cowed squatters refused point-blank to advance another inch towards the scene of unholy worship. So Inspector Legrasse and his 19 colleagues plunged on unguided into arcades of horror that none of them had ever trod before. The region now entered by the police was one of traditionally evil repute. There were a legend of a hidden lake, unglimpsed by mortal sight, in which dwelled a huge, formless, white polypus thing with luminous eyes, and squatters whispered that bat-winged devils flew up out of caverns in inner earth to worship it at midnight. They said it had been there before D'Iberville, before La Salle, before the Indians, and before even the wholesome beasts and birds of the woods. It was nightmare itself, and to see it was to die. But it made men dream, and so they knew enough to keep away. The present voodoo assembly was indeed on the merest fringe of this abhorred area, but that location was bad enough. Hence perhaps the very place of the worship had terrified the squatters more than the shocking sounds and incidents. Only poetry or madness could do justice to the noises heard by Legrasse's men as they plowed on through the moors towards the red glare and the muffled tom-toms. There are vocal qualities peculiar to men and vocal qualities peculiar to beasts, and it is terrible to hear the one when the source should heal the other. Animal fury, not furry. Furry is a different thing. Animal fury in orgistic license or whipped themselves to demoniac heights by howls and squawking ecstasies that tore and reverberated through those nighted woods like pestilential tempests from the gulfs of hell. Now and then, the less organized ululations would cease, and from what seemed a well-drilled chorus of hoarse voices would rise in sing-song chant that hideous phrase or ritual. In his house, truly a dead Cthulhu waits dreaming. Then the men, having reached a spot where the trees were thinner, came suddenly in sight of the spectacle itself. 4 of them reeled, 1 fainted, and 2 were shaken into a frantic cry which the mad cacophony deadened. The grass dashed swamp water on the face of the fainting man, and all stood trembling and nearly hypnotized with terror. In a natural glade of the swamp stood a grassy island of perhaps an acre's extent, clear of trees and tolerably dry. On this now leaped and twisted a more indescribable horde of human abnormality that any could find. Void of clothing, this hybrid spawn were braying, bellowing, and writhing about a monstrous ring-shaped bonfire, in the center of which, revealed by occasional rifts in the curtain of flame, stood a great granite monolith, some 8 feet in height, on top of which, incongruous in its diminutiveness, rested the noxious carven statuette. From a wide circle of 10 scaffolds, set up at regular intervals with the flame-girt monolith as a center hung, head downward, the ugly marred bodies of the helpless squatters who had disappeared. It was inside this circle that the ring of worshippers jumped and roared, the general direction of the mass motion being from left to right, an endless bacchanal between the ring of bodies and the ring of fire. It may have been only imagination, and it may have been only echoes, which induced one of the men, an excitable Spaniard, to fancy he heard antiphonal responses to the ritual from some far and unknown spot deeper within the wood of ancient legendary and horror. This man, Joseph D. Galvez, I later met and questioned, and he proved distractingly imaginative. He indeed went so far as to hint of the faint beating of great wings and of a glimpse of shining eyes and a mountain white bulk beyond the remotest trees. But I suppose he'd been hearing too much superstition. Actually, the horrified pause of the man was of comparatively brief duration. Duty came first, and although there must have been nearly 100 people celebrating in the throng, the police relied on their firearm and plunged determinedly into the nauseous rot. For 5 minutes, the resultant din and chaos were beyond description. Wild blows were struck, shots were fired, and escapes were made. But in the end, Legras was able to count some 47 prisoners, being forced to dress in haste and fall into line between 2 rows of policemen. 5 of the worshippers lay dead, and 2 severely wounded were carried away on an improvised stretcher by their fellow prisoner. The image on the monolith, of course, was carefully removed and carried by Legras. Examined at headquarters after a trip of intense strain and weariness, the prisoner all proved to be men of very low and mentally barren type. Most were seamen, largely West Indian, Brava Portuguese from the Cape Verde Islands. But before many questions were asked, it became manifest something far deeper and older, that whatever beliefs there was in there, degraded and ignorant as they were, the creatures held with surprising consistency to the central idea of their loathsome fate. They worshipped, so they said, the great old ones who lived ages before there were any men, and who came to the young world out of the sky. Those old ones were gone now, inside the earth and under the sea. But their dead bodies had told their secrets and dreams to the first man who formed a cult which had never died. This was that cult, and the prisoners said it had always existed and always would exist, hidden in distant wastes and dark places all over the world, until the time when the great priest Cthulhu, from his dark house in the mighty city of Lille under the waters, should rise and bring the earth again beneath his sway. Someday he would call, when the stars were ready. Meanwhile, no more must be told. It was a secret which even torture could not extract. Mankind was not absolutely alone among the conscious things of earth, for shapes came out of the dark to visit the faithful few. But these were not the great old ones. No man had ever seen the old ones. The carven idol was great Cthulhu, but none might see whether or not the others were precisely like him. No one could read the old writing now, but things were told by word of mouth. The chanted rituals was not the secret that was never spoken aloud, only whispered. The chant meant only this: in his house at Rolia, dead Cthulhu waits dreaming. Only 2 of the prisoners were found sane enough to be hanged. The rest were committed to various institutions. All denied a part in the ritual murders. But of those mysterious allies, no coherent account could ever be gained. What the Polos did extract came mainly from an immensely aged man named Castro, who claimed to have sailed to strange ports and talked with undying leaders of the cult in the mountains of China. Old Castro remembered bits of hideous legends that paled the speculations of theosophists and made man and the world seem recent and transient indeed. There had been eons when other things ruled on the earth, and they had great cities. Remains of them, he said, the deathless Chinamen had told him, were still to be found at Cyclopean stones on islands in the Pacific. They all died vast epochs of time before man came, but there were arts which could revive them when the stars had come round again to the right positions in the cycle of eternity. They had indeed come themselves from the star, and brought their images with them. These great old ones, Castro continued, were not composed altogether of flesh and blood. They had shape, for did not the star fashioned image prove it? But that shape was not made of matter. When the stars were right, they could plunge from world to world through the sky, but when the stars were wrong, they could not live. But although they no longer lived, they would never really die. They all lay in stone houses in their great city of Rilia, preserved by the spells of mighty Cthulhu for a glorious resurrection when the stars and the earth might once more be ready for them. But at that time, some force from outside must serve to liberate their bodies. The spells that preserved them intact likewise prevented them from making an initial move, and they could only lie awake in the dark and think, whilst uncounted millions of years rolled by. They knew all that was occurring in the universe, for their mode of speech was transmitted thought. Even now they talked in their tombs, when after infinities of chaos, the first men came. The great old ones spoke to the sensitive among them by molding their dreams, for only thus could their language reach the fleshly minds of mammals. Then, whispered Castro, those first men formed the cult around small idols, which the great ones showed them. Idols brought in dim eras from the dark stars. That cult would never die till the stars came right again, and the secret priests would take great Cthulhu from his tomb to revive his subject and resume his rule of Earth. The time would be easy to know, for then mankind would have become as the great old ones, free and wild and beyond good and evil, with laws and morals thrown aside, and all men shouting and killing and reveling in joy. Then the liberated old ones would teach them new ways to shout and kill and revel and enjoy themselves. And all the earth would flame in ecstasy and freedom. Meanwhile, the cult, by appropriate rites, must keep alive the memory of those ancient ways and shadow forth the prophecy of their return. In the elder time, chosen men had talked with the entombed old ones in dreams, but then had something happened. The great stone city Aurelia, with its monolith and sepulchres, had sunk beneath the waves and the deep waters, full of the one primal mystery through which not even thought can pass, had cut off the spectral intercourse. But memory never dies. And the high priest said that the city would rise again when the stars were right. Then came out of the earth black spirits of earth, and full of dim rumors, picked up in caverns beneath forgotten sea bottoms. But of of them, old Castro dare not speak much. He cut himself off hurriedly, and no amount of persuasion or subtlety could elicit more in this direction. The size of the old ones, too, he curiously declined to mention. Of the cult, he said that he thought the center lay amid the pathless desert of Arabia, where Iram, the city of pillars, dreams, hidden and untouched. It was not allied to the European witch cult, and was virtually unknown beyond its members. No book had ever really hinted of it, though the deathless Chinaman said that there were double meanings in the Necronomicon of the matter Abdul Alzred, which the initiated might read as they chose, especially the much-discussed play, that is not dead which can eternally lie, and with strange eons even death may die. Legras, deeply interested and not a little bewildered, had inquired in vain concerning the historic affiliations of the cult. Castro apparently told the truth when he said that it was wholly secret. The authorities of Atulan University could shed no light upon either cult or image, and now the detective had come to the highest authorities in the country, and met with no more than the Greenland tale of Professor Webb. The feverish interest aroused at the meeting by Legras's tale, corroborated as it was by the statuette, is echoed in the subsequent correspondence of those who attended, although scant mention occurs in the formal publication of the society. Caution is the first case of those accustomed to face occasional charlatanry and imposture. Legras for some time lent the image to Professor Webb, but at the later's death it was returned to him and remains in his possession, where I viewed it not long ago. It truly is a terrible thing, and unmistakably akin to the dream sculpture of young Wilcox. That my uncle was excited by the tale of the sculpture I did not wonder, for what thoughts must arise upon hearing, after knowledge of what Legras had learned of the cult, of a sensitive young man who had dreamed not only the figure and exact hieroglyphics of the swamp-found image and the Greenland devil tablet, but had come in his dreams upon at least 3 of the precise words of the formulas uttered alike by the cultist and diabolistics. Professor Angel's instant start on an investigation of the utmost thoroughness was eminently natural, though privately I suspected young Wilcox of having heard of the cult in some indirect way, and of having invented a series of dreams to heighten and continuate the mystery at my uncle's expense. The dream narratives and cuttings collected by the professor were, of course, strong corroboration, but the rationalism of my mind and the extravagance of the whole subject led me to adopt what I thought the most sensible conclusions. So, after thoroughly studying the manuscript again and correlating the theosophical and anthropological notes with the cult narratives of Legras, I made a trip to Providence to see the sculptor and give him the rebuke I thought proper for so boldly imposing upon unlearned and aged men. Wilcox still lived alone in the Fleur-de-Lis building in Thomas Street, a hideous Victorian imitation of 17th century Breton architecture, which flaunts its stuccoed front amidst the lovely colonial houses on the ancient hill, and under the very shadow of the finest Georgian steeple in America. I found him at work in his rooms, and at once conceded. I need a second to understand what he's trying to say then. I found him at work in his room, and at once conceded from the people around that his genius is indeed profound and authentic. He will, I believe, be heard from some time as one of the great decadents, for he has crystallized in clay and will one day mirror in marble those nightmares and fantasies which Arthur McCann evokes in prose and Clark Ashton Smith makes visible in verse and in painting. dark, frail, somewhat unkempt in aspect. He turned languidly at my knock and asked me my business without rising. When I told him who I was, he displayed some interest, for my uncle had excited his curiosity in probing his strange dreams, yet had never explained the reason for the study. I did not enlarge his knowledge in this regard, but sought with some subtlety to draw him out. In a short time, I became convinced of his absolute sincerity, for he spoke of the dreams in a manner none could mistake. They, and their subconscious residuum, had influenced his art profoundly. And he showed me a morbid statue whose contours almost made me shake with the potency of its suggestion. He could not recall having seen the original of this thing except in his own dream bas-relief, but the outlines had formed themselves insensibly under his hands. It was, no doubt, the giant shape he had raved of in the delirium. That he really knew nothing of the hidden cult, save from what my uncle's relentless catechism out of that fall, he soon made clear. And again, I strove to think of some way in which he could possibly have received the weird impressions. He talked of his dream in a strangely poetic fashion, making me see with terrible vividness the damp cyclopean cities of slimy greenstones, whose geometry, he oddly said, was all wrong. And here, with frightened expectancy, the ceaseless, half-mental calling from underground. Cthulhu Fatang, Cthulhu Fatang. These words had formed parts of that dread ritual, which told of dead Cthulhu's dream vigil in his stone-vaulted relief, and I felt deeply moved despite my rational beliefs. Wilcox, I was sure, had heard of the cult in some casual way, and had soon forgotten it amidst the mass of his equally weird reading and imagining. Later, by virtue of its sheer impressiveness, it had found subconscious expression in dreams in the bas-relief, and in the terrible statue I now beheld. So that his imposture upon my uncle had been a very innocent one. The youth was of a type at once slightly affected and slightly ill-mannered, which I could never like, but I was willing enough now to admit both his genius and his honesty. I took leave of him amicably, and wished him all the success his talent promises. The matter of the cult still remained to fascinate me, and at times I had visions of personal fame from researches to its origins and connections. I visited New Orleans, talked with Legrasse and others of that old-time raiding party, saw the frightful image, and even questions such of the prisoners as still survived. Old Castro, unfortunately, had been dead for some years. What I now heard so graphically at first hand, though it was really no more than a detailed confirmation of what my uncle had written, excited me afresh. For I felt sure that I was on the track of a very real, very secret, and very ancient religion, whose discovery would make me an anthropologist of note. My attitude was still one of absolute materialism, as I wish it still were, and I discounted with almost an inexplicable perversity the coincidence of the dream notes and odd cuttings collected by Professor Angels. One thing which I began to suspect, and which I now fear I know, is that my uncle's death was far from natural. He fell on a narrow hill street leading up from an ancient waterfront after a careless push from a sailor. I did not forget... and not forget and would not be surprised to learn of secret methods and poison needles as ruthless and as anciently known as cryptic rites and beliefs. Legrasse and his men, it is true, have been let alone, but in Norway a certain seaman who saw things is dead. Might not the deeper inquiries of my uncle after encountering the sculptor's data have come to sinister ears? I think Professor Angel died because he knew too much. Or because he was likely to learn too much. Whether I shall go as he did remains to be seen, for I have learned much now. And this, my dear friends, is where we're going to end it. Did you have fun? Was this what you guys call a fun story? I hope you had fun. I hope you were relaxed. You will now proceed to fall asleep for a long time. But I will see you again tomorrow. Don't forget that you'll have to wake up eventually. Also, you have no idea how much I had to censor what was written in there. Anyways, thank you. And how do you say it again? Ah, yes. O-S-S-A-D-O. O-S-S-A-D-O.